has not been the best of the leaders. He starts off, remember, as one with the Hasidim or the Pharisaic tendencies. Then he repudiates that. This is provided for you on your chart. And he declares himself, as they say there, a Sadducee. So he ends up, and really he's had all along more of the Hellenistic spirit to him, which makes him not the best ruler for the nation of Israel. About the only other point of significance there was whenever Attalus gave his kingdom of Pergamon in Asia Minor to Rome, which starts Rome's move eastwardly. So coming to Aristobulus the first, we're going to have another one, and we're going to have another Hyrcanus as well. We'll have Aristobulus and Hyrcanus the first and the second. The first is generally not called the first because he's called by his first name as well as his last, John Hyrcanus, or the two names generally go together. Just really two first names is what we have there. But you'll see whenever we get down to starting at 76 B.C. onwardly, then we'll be looking at a Hyrcanus the second. Okay, before John Hyrcanus died, he appointed his wife as the new political leader and ruler. Just before he died, Hyrcanus appointed his wife to be the new ruler in his stead, and his eldest son, Aristobulus, to be high priest. So that's, I guess, where we need to begin now. His wife, the wife of Hyrcanus, was appointed to be the new ruler, that is, the new political ruler, and his eldest son, Aristobulus I, was to be the high priest. However, after the actual death in 104 B.C. of Hyrcanus, then Aristobulus had his mother, really she was his stepmother, but had his mother and several of his half-brothers thrown into prison. I guess I need to maybe go a little more slowly because I just have a lot of narrative material to give to connect all of this. There are not a lot of interesting points right now. Sad to say, there are not a lot of interesting points, but it all has to be connected in as brief a fashion as possible. So, in other words, he's kind of the black sheep of the family, Aristobulus II. He has his stepmother and several of his half-brothers, those who come from this mother, which wasn't his mother, but the mother of these half-brothers of his, or step-brothers of his. They were all cast into prison where most of them starved to death. And those that didn't starve to death and didn't actually make it into prison, then he had their heads cut off. So he wasn't a good brother or a good son. But he had one full brother whose name was Antigonus. We've got one fellow by that name way further down on your chart, way down at 40 B.C. You see Antigonus, king and high priest. It's a fellow by that name, so you can see how to spell the name there. Around 40 B.C., Antigonus, king and high priest. Aristobulus has one full brother whom he likes very much. The step-brothers or half-brothers he doesn't care for. He has them executed or thrown in prison, but his full brother, Antigonus, he likes very much. And after his stepmother is thrown into prison, then he elevates his brother, his full brother Antigonus, to rule the land with him politically. So that Antigonus was to be the political ruler, more or less, a puppet ruler behind Aristobulus, and Aristobulus was to be the religious ruler, the high priest. But during all of this commotion, and that's what it is, where Aristobulus has to send out orders to make sure that his men know which brothers of his to lock up, which to execute, which mother of his to have thrown in prison. During all of this confusion, or really a little bit after this, he gets in an accidental state of affairs where he sends out an order that's misinterpreted, but it was an order to execute his full brother Antigonus, which is exactly what they did, which is not what Aristobulus meant or wanted at all. And it's kind of believed by historians that it caused him to go insane because he was inordinately attached to his full brother. The only full brother that he had was Antigonus. And so, in other words, by the affairs of Aristobulus, he really, in a roundabout way, ends up murdering his own brother, the very one that he loved. That's interesting. It seems like either God or the devil, whoever you want to blame that on, works things out like that, so that you, when you try to save your one brother, it's actually you who ends up killing the person. So this bothered him quite a bit. It drove him to drinking, like many different things will do. It drove him to drinking. And he just, in general, went insane and died right after this, after a reign of just a little over a year. So all of this takes place in just a matter of a few months of time. You've got on your chart 104 to 102, but we're talking about like most of the way through 104 and only part of the way through 102, so that gives you just a little over a year reign. But 104 to 102 doesn't mean 2 years, it just means a little over a year. Now we have one note under his name there on the chart. He was the first in the Hasmonean, or the Maccabean for that matter, line to actually use the official title of king. Your chart there has, he assumes the title of, quote, king, unquote. That is why I've always been careful to call the others semi or quasi-kings. They were not kings in the technical sense, chiefly because they had never assumed that title for themselves. But Aristobulus is the first of the Maccabeans, or the first of the Hasmoneans, to officially assume the title king for himself. This title appears on the coins that were minted by him. That's one of several ways that we know this is true. By the way, Josephus, again, the Jewish historian, 1st century A.D. Jewish historian Josephus is our primary, is everyone's primary reference source for all of this material that we're discussing. Like I said, you can find his name on coins, so there's an extra Josephus reference or an account of the existence, the historicity of Aristobulus I. But all of the details and basically all that we know and understand has come through the writings of Josephus. Now, if you're thinking along with me here, really if you have to be thinking kind of in reverse, what would you think is interesting, or what would you think is unique? Just one point in history that doesn't prove a lot, but it's just interesting or unique regarding Aristobulus assuming this title king. Or to ask it another way, when was this used prior to this time? How long has it been since the last one? Babylonian captivity. The Babylonian captivity has been that long ago, way back to Zedekiah, the last of the kings. It's been that long ago since we had a ruler in Israel, whether from Israel or from Judah. The last time we had an official Jewish ruler that went by the title King Zedekiah, was way back in 586 B.C. That's probably why they have a note on the chart, and it makes it rather interesting and rather important that we've gone for this many centuries without a Jewish king, official Jewish king. So Aristobulus I is the first official Jewish king by that title after the Babylonian captivity. Now, like many others of this period, he went by two different names, or he had two different names. We see lots of people along this time that had two different names. Aristobulus was his Greek name, and his Hebrew name was Judah. Aristobulus was just the Greek form of the Hebrew name of Judah. And he chose to use the Greek name because he was in total agreement with the spirit of Hellenism. And so obviously he'd choose his Greek name and not his Hebrew name. As a matter of fact, maybe the title king itself was revived just to impress his pagan Gentile neighbor nations around him. It's been suggested that was really the only reason for the revival of the title king, because he was not a king in the sense of the former kings of Israel and Judah, and he was just using this to impress his neighbors, his pagan neighbors around him, because they had leaders that went by this title over them. Territorially, let's discuss just briefly what he did territorially, since this was our primary thrust in looking at his father last time. John Hyrcanus was looking at the territorial expansion. He pushed the boundaries of Palestine further north than had Hyrcanus. As a matter of fact, all the way up to Mount Lebanon. all the way up to Mount Lebanon. And I'll show you this on the overhead here in a few moments whenever we get to the next leader, and then we'll have to come back to this. So he's pushing his way up through the northern fringes of Galilee then. You know, Israel's divided into Galilee in the north, Samaria in the middle, and Judea in the south. So he has pushed his way all the way up in the northern fringes of Israel, which would be the northern fringes of Galilee. And here's an interesting note you want to get down. He forced circumcision in the Jewish life on the people of this territory. He forced circumcision. Just like Hyrcanus had done to the south, remember last week, that he had forced it on the Idumeans that had come up. And we said that was going to be very important later on, that John Hyrcanus had forced circumcision in the Jewish religion on the people of the south. That's way down here in Idumea. Now we have it imposed on them way up north, up here in Galilee, the northern part of Galilee. Now what's interesting about this is that many of these people were in fact Gentiles and not Jews. Of course, the Idumeans were not Jews either. They were Gentiles. Came from Abraham, so maybe closer to being a Jew than a lot of these Greek people that lived up in northern Galilee. But this religious subjugation of northern Galilee, I think, is especially interesting in light of the large part that this region plays in the gospel accounts. The gospel accounts have a lot to say. For instance, one passage comes to mind over in Matthew chapter 4, I believe. Yeah, Matthew chapter 4. I want you to notice the terminology here. This is probably interesting because remember Jesus' ministry, most of his ministry is stationed in Galilee, Capernaum or Capernaum. Up on the Sea of Galilee is his chief base throughout through all of his ministry. Capernaum is Jesus' home city, not Nazareth, but Capernaum, because that evidently is where some of his apostles, some of his disciples were from, and they had homes there, and so he had a place to stay. So that was his base, and he's always ministering around the Sea of Galilee. And that's up here, and then on occasions he'll either come through Samaria, he does over there in John 4, he'll come through Samaria on the way to Jerusalem, or many times he'll cross over to what we call Perea or Transjordan, across the Jordan River, so he doesn't have to go through the territory of the Samaritans, because the Samaritans, remember, are no-nos as far as the Jews are concerned. They're half-bred people. He would go across the Jordan, go down through Perea or Transjordan, and cross back over the Jordan at a place called Bethany beyond Jordan. There were two Bethanies in the Bible, one called Bethany beyond Jordan, and one Bethany that's just a little bit east of Jerusalem. It's just on the other side of the Mount of Olives, and of course that is where Mary and Martha and Lazarus were from. Verses 12 through 16 of Matthew chapter 4. Now when Jesus, and tie this into what I've just said, that Aristobulus has gone up here and imposed circumcision in the Jewish way of life on Gentile people in the northern fringes of Israel's territory, which would be northern Galilee. And it's interesting because of the large role that Galilee, especially northern Galilee, plays in the earthly ministry of Christ. And heard that John was cast into prison, he departed into Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt at Capernaum, which is upon the sea coast in the borders of Zebulun and Naphtali, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond Jordan. And look at this strange phrase here, Galilee of the Gentiles. It's a strange phrase in the Bible and has to have some meaning, probably because it had a large Jewish or large Gentile population, rather, especially up at its northern fringe, not so much south. South, you get down near Tiberias, which was the capital of Antipas that was over on the Sea of Galilee, Sepphoris, which was the original capital, Cana, which you know, Nazareth, you even know better. These are cities all to the south. As you go towards north, of course, you're headed towards Tyre and Sidon. And Jesus, on occasion, actually went out of Israel up to what was in Phoenicia, to Tyre and Sidon. And he even went over in Matthew 16 once up to Caesarea Philippi, which is way up north in the Sea of Galilee. But you're getting up in the northern part, and so probably that's why we have this term here. And for me, it's very interesting. I've always thought this term was interesting to understand maybe the origin of having these Gentile people somehow like a magnet sucked in or brought into Israel. It was way back here during the time of Aristobulus. Galilee of the Gentiles. The people which sat in darkness, here we got Gentiles, that have been forced to be circumcised and accept the Jewish way of life, but they don't know what's going on. They don't have the benefits of having been raised from childhood on the teachings of Moses. So it's just a religious cult to them, and these guys, Aristobulus and his men, come in and force you to be circumcised and adopt their religion. You don't really know much of what's going on. And so look to whom Jesus came then. He didn't come to all these proud Jews down in Jerusalem. He goes up to these, not even Jews, they're Gentiles, but they're circumcised Gentiles up in Galilee. The people which sat in darkness. See, Israel, we could never say Israel sat in darkness. She had the light of the Word and the light of the prophets all through her history. So this couldn't apply to a Jew. This is to a Gentile here. The people which sat in darkness saw great light. And to them which sat in the region and the shadow of death, light is sprung up. See, all down here you've got your Jewish people, and then all the way up here you've got the Seleucid Empire, the Syrians. You've got pure Greeks up there. And then you've got these Gentiles that have been circumcised kind of in between. And that's interesting when it says that they sat in the region and the shadow of death. That would be this region up here. It's death where the Gentiles are. It's light wherever Israel is. They sat right on the border of being over into death. And Jesus brought them light. So that's an interesting side note there. Remember that in all these studies that we try to do, it will make everything more understandable and more meaningful to you. You won't be able to tie every single phrase with what I say into some passage of the New Testament and say, now I understand this better. But let's say just this whole business of Pharisees and Sadducees, you have to just listen and listen and listen and hear and hear and hear, teaching after teaching, until you can pick the flavor of something up. Otherwise, you're stuck with a couple of little, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points that you know about a certain thing. Such as the Sadducees, what I always hear is they were sad, you see. And that's how they got their name, Sadducee. Haven't we probably all heard that? Whoever says that knows nothing about the origin of the Sadducees. It's just so stupid. That's a little cliche that almost all religious teachers use. They were sad, you see, because they didn't believe in the resurrection. You know, we know they didn't believe in that. They didn't believe in spirits, angels, the resurrection. And that made them sad, you see, and that's where they got their name. Well, that's cute for people that come to church to hear rhymes all the time, but it gives you no understanding of the Sadducees if you're wanting to comprehend what's going on in the Gospels. Everybody's sad besides Jesus and the apostles, so that's not telling us anything. What's really going on with scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, Herodians, things like that. So hopefully studies like this, they do to me, they get me into the whole train of thought and the flavor so that you're not stuck with that proof text syndrome, a few points that you know about somebody. And it doesn't prove that you really know anything at all. Okay, that's enough with Aristobulus. Let's move on to the next leader, Alexander Jannaeus. Alexander Jannaeus. Okay, the widow of Aristobulus, who's a wicked, wicked man. And Jannaeus is going to be worse than Aristobulus. The widow of Aristobulus. He's the one who had his stepmother killed, his half-brothers killed, and accidentally killed his full brother Antigonus. But he was married. Of all things, he was married. The widow of this wicked Aristobulus was one Salome Alexandra. S-A-L-O-M-E, like salami, Salome. Salome Alexandra. D-R-A at the end, Alexandra, instead of D-E-R. Salome Alexandra is perhaps the most important of all Hasmonean or Maccabean women. So you ought to have her name underlined and with some stars beside it. We haven't discussed, notice in this study of intertestamental period, too much about any women, because we just have not had any women of importance thus far. Unless you want to say the mother of all the men of importance that we've studied. I guess that makes him important to bear an important son. But Salome Alexandra will definitely be the most important of the Maccabean or the Hasmonean women at which we will look. And she's going to come up again very, very soon. I'm just going to mention something about her as she ties in here. By the way, as usual, we have our double name, our Hebrew and Greek name, combination of names. Salome is a Greek name. It's just the Greek form of shalom in Hebrew. So her name means peace. Salome is the Greek peace. And Alexander is just a feminine form of Alexander. Now, after her husband died, Aristobulus. I'm trying to keep all the people correct. After her husband died, then there were a few remaining half-brothers of his that were still alive in prison, almost starved to death, but still alive. And she had them released and picked, I guess, the best looking of them and married him. And had him made king and high priest. He went from almost starving to death in prison to the next day king and high priest in Israel. So this would be a surviving half-brother of Aristobulus, and his name is Alexander Jannaeus. Okay, she has him released, one of the few remaining half-brothers still alive, and marries him. Now we've got Jews on our hands. So if she was married to Aristobulus, and now she's married to the brother of Aristobulus, Jannaeus, do we have a problem according to Mosaic law here? A woman that's married two brothers? Do we have a problem? If we do, what is the problem? Let's just say that they're brothers. That's all we really need to be concerned about, that they're brothers. Do we have a problem here? Well, we would only remember the account with the Sadducees over in the Gospels that the woman married a brother and no sons, and he died and then married his brother, and no problems there. That was called, according to Deuteronomy chapter 25, the levirate law of marriage. It comes from a Latin word that means brother, or brother-in-law, rather. The levirate law of marriage. The only time you would have a problem is if a child, if a son, was born through the first marriage. In other words, if Alexandra, Salome Alexandra, had born a son to Aristobulus, then the whole business of levirate marriage is to give us a male descendant to whom all the property can come and through whom descendants can come. And so if you don't have a male descendant, then we have no problem. What you have to do is, if you've got a brother, if the man has a brother alive, then the widow should go marry the brother. Of course, the problem with the son born there is that the son born there does not really count in the family of someone like Jannaeus. It would go back and count for someone like Aristobulus. So they correctly marry, according to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 to 10, because Salome and Aristobulus had no male children. So she marries a brother of his, Jannaeus, in order to fulfill the levirate law of marriage. That's interesting in itself, that a group of people, especially Jannaeus, as wicked as he was, are concerned enough to obey the levirate law of marriage. Although he might not have done it for that reason, that just is what got him out of prison and made him become king and high priest. Jannaeus, we got a double name here. Jannaeus is the Hellenized form of Jonathan, so his real name was Alexander Jonathan. Or it comes from, it's a Hellenized form of a shortened form of Jonathan. Okay, he rules, Alexander Jannaeus rules from 102 to 76 BC, from 102 to 76 BC. And just like Hyrcanus, his chief aim was military conquest and territorial expansion. We're going to look at this here in just a moment. His chief aim was military conquest and territorial expansion, although he was not nearly as successful as Hyrcanus. Now I try to, in order to keep all these names straight, I try to mark down on my chart. I've got a different one here. This is my church one. I bring my home one. I don't know if my church one's all doctored up. Nope, it's not. Well, part of it is. That's why I bring my personal one. A notation of whether these guys are any good or not. Hyrcanus, I've got bad. Aristobulus, bad. Jannaeus is the worst of the Hasmonean leaders. So probably be easy to remember him just for that. He is definitely by far, and I'll tell you some stories about him that we get from Josephus here in a moment, he is definitely by far the worst of them. Military conquest, territorial expansion. I think we're looking at a map here that dates to Herod's time, a little bit later. Herod comes on the scene ruling Israel 37 to 4 BC, but it's all essentially the same. Okay, let's do 1, 2, 3, a couple of things that he does as far as military conquests and territorial expansion are concerned. First of all, he attacks Ptolemais. He attacks the Egyptian town Ptolemais. Obviously, it gets its name from the Ptolemies, was still really, it had Egyptian citizens here. His attack on this city was a miserable failure and almost cost him the entire nation. Let me explain. Here's Ptolemais. It's a little bit north of Mount Carmel, way over here on the Mediterranean coast. And by the way, getting back to what we were talking about with the man before, here's Galilee, here's Samaria, here's Judea. Here we're talking about the northern fringes of Galilee up here. Mount Lebanon, just off the map, but it runs about like this. This is part of Mount Lebanon right here. It comes down to the coast and it comes down to a valley in between. It's not even on there. Can we lower that a little and let's see if it's, oh, it's printed on it. Here's Mount Lebanon. It says right there, the mountains. Important, Israel doesn't really have any important mountains. We talk about Mount Zion, but it's more like a Vermont type mountain. It's not a real mountain. The important mountains anywhere close to Israel are of course up here in Phoenicia. Here's Mount Lebanon, and you see this little white cap right here, that's Mount Hermon. It's mentioned in Scripture. You can see it from the Sea of Galilee, and it has a perpetual ice cap on the top. So we know we're talking about a tall, high mountain there. This is Mount Hermon. It's mentioned oftentimes in the Old Testament right there. Not very far from Damascus, the important city. Mount Hermon, Mount Lebanon. You're getting to know your geography as we put this up here all the time, your maps better? Good. You just remember where all these towns are. Here's Ptolemais. So he attacks Ptolemais, a miserable failure. The citizens here cry for help from the Ptolemies in Egypt, since we've got Egyptian citizens that have settled this territory. And the army of Queen Cleopatra III, you see her on the chart here. She rules from 116 to 101 BC in Egypt. The armies, so this happens right at the very beginning of the reign of Junius, because we barely have an overlap of 102 to 101. Cleopatra III's army comes up and almost overruns the whole nation of Israel. Junius almost made an irreversible mistake here by attacking Ptolemais. He didn't need to court the trouble of Cleopatra, and he probably didn't know of the power of Cleopatra's army at that time. Cleopatra almost overruns the entire land of Israel. If she would have done that, of course, the country would be annexed and would be back to this business of Egypt controls it for a while, then Syria. Remember that we've had it from 320 down to 198 by the Egyptians, and then from 198 down to 165, or down to May of 142, religious and then political, by the Seleucids. Now we have a period of about 100 years, or 80 or so years, of political independence. It almost fell back into the hands of the Egyptians again. Once the Seleucids gained control of Palestine in 198, then the Egyptians never controlled it, never have controlled it after that time. But you say, well, she overran the country, and she could and came close. She could have, if she had desired, to annex the whole country. Why didn't she? Well, her commander-in-chief, the commander-in-chief of her armed forces, was a Jew. And he said, Cleopatra, let me give you some advice. That wouldn't be a good thing to do. Seemed like he had some Jewish tendencies still left to him, although he probably was a good Egyptian, Ptolemaic, Hellenistically minded Jew. He evidently still had a love for his fatherland. So he advised Cleopatra against that and said what we ought to do is sign a truce with the people. So that's exactly what they did, and Junius gets out scot-free. He has to leave Ptolemais, but nothing is taken from his as a result of that. Remarkable little battle that takes place, where it could have almost gone either way, and as a matter of fact, nothing at all happens. So he goes up to Ptolemais. Second place, he takes some of the cities over in Transjordan. By now you're familiar with this area. Over here it's Transjordan. Trans means across. Transamerica, airlines across America. Transjordan is across Jordan. It's also called Perea, especially the bottom portion of it, Perea. It was part of the tetrarchy along with Galilee of Herod Antipas, the fox of the Gospels. And he takes some Philistine cities such as Jaffa, which has gone back and forth. We discussed that as one of the cities with Hyrcanus. So it kind of goes back and forth being controlled. Remember, this is where the important trade route is, along the maritime plains. The Mediterranean coast are called the maritime plains in Israel. So a few Transjordan cities, I don't need to name them, they're not of any importance, and a few of the old Palestine or the Philistine ones. And then in the third place, he tries to take all of what we could call southern Transjordan. It's off the bottom of the map, but the territory that formerly belonged to the Ammonites and particularly to the Moabites, way down here to the southeast of the Dead Sea. He tried to take this, but he was repulsed by the Nabatean Arabs, and he barely escaped back to Jerusalem with his life. That's the extent of what we need to discuss about his ambitions for new territory. Now, he had very pronounced Hellenistic tendencies. He was certainly one of those who had pronounced Hellenistic tendencies. However, most of the people were the popular backing was behind the party of the Pharisees. So because he was more Sadducee-oriented, he was continually alienating himself from the people. I want to tell you two stories, give you two accounts, good descriptive accounts of his alienation of the popular people and why we had so many problems, why we rank him probably as the most wicked of the Hasmonean leaders. First of all, both of these accounts come from Josephus. First of all, one memorable account on a Feast of Tabernacle day. At a Feast of Tabernacles, he as the high priest is officiating. He's part of a priestly line, so he was officiating, and all of the people, we'd have to go into a lot of detail to describe how the whole ceremony was conducted, but really that's beyond our considerations now. Just suffice it to say that he was the officiating priest, the high priest, so he was the officiating one. And after the ceremony at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, he was supposed to pour out the holy water in a certain place.
For the continuation of this message, please turn.
And after the ceremony at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, he was supposed to pour out the holy water in a certain place. And he poured out the holy water, it was part of their liturgy, by his feet, right on the ground, instead of on the altar. And pouring it on the altar was the ritual of the Pharisees. And because most of the people were behind the Pharisees, that's where the popular backing was, behind the Pharisees, the people began to shout obscenities at him, because really that almost, you see in effect, that negates the whole Feast of Tabernacles when the concluding ceremony, you're pouring the water out at your feet in the dust, in the dirt, on the ground, and not on the altar. So you negate the whole ceremony through which you've gone. So the people began to shout obscenities and throw vegetables and produce at him, vegetables and fruit, and smash him with oranges and things like that. And so he has his feelings hurt. He's been humiliated in front of everyone. And he orders his troops, who were mercenary troops. He had to hire them. You really couldn't get many Jews to follow you. He ordered his mercenary troops in their midst and slaughtered 600 of the Jews right before the temple at the Feast of Tabernacles. And that began an open civil war in Israel. Now, that lasts for a while, open civil war, and the Pharisees, you see, Janius has many mercenary troops behind him. The Pharisees really don't have an army or anything like that, no army to speak of behind them. So the Pharisees ask the Syrians to come and help. You see, this is going to get the Pharisees in trouble. The Egyptians had almost taken the country, and now the Syrians are invading the country. The Pharisees asked the Syrians to come and help, and that's exactly what they proceed to do. And they push old wicked Alexander Janius right out of Israel, all the way down into Idumea. Push him right out into the wilderness. And so all is going well. You can turn that off. So all is going well. But then the Pharisees get thinking, now, is it worse to have Janius as leader or the Syrians in control of the country? They begin to wonder, what if Syria, now that she has pushed Janius all the way out of the country, what if Syria decides not to leave the country? And so right about this time, right at the very threshold of the utter defeat of Janius, the Pharisees who had been fighting on the side and supporting the Syrians, thousands and thousands of them desert from the Syrians and go over to the side of Junius. And of course that gives more firepower, as it were, to the side of Junius, and they're able to push the Syrians back out of the country. And the logic to this, the Pharisees are thinking, well, hopefully Junius has learned his lesson now. He's learned the lesson that we can call on Syria, or we can hire our own mercenary troops, or we can call on someone else and come and defeat him if need be. So they thought that he had learned his lesson, but he hadn't. As soon as all the Pharisees came over on the side of Junius and then end up pushing the Syrians right out of the country, then Junius, immediately after this, searches out for the leaders among the Pharisees, the leaders of this revolt. And then at a banquet in Jerusalem one night, he has 800 Pharisees crucified out in public. This is why he was not a very good leader. And he didn't get along very well with the people. That's why I rank him as the most wicked of the lot. Not very many of them were any good, but he has to be the bottom of them all. And that's not the end of the story, just leading up to the real gory part of the story. He has 800 Pharisees crucified. And you know, it takes a couple of hours to actually die from crucifixion. And so he waits until most of the Pharisees are right down to death's door, as it were. And then he brings all of their wives and children before their crosses and cuts their arms and heads and gorges their eyes out, just massacres and slaughters all of their wives and children. And so that produced another civil war in Israel. Israel producing her own civil wars. And the only thing that really brings about any change is he finally dies in 76 BC. And tradition holds, like old wicked King Manasseh in the Old Testament, tradition holds that Junius was confessing his sins on his deathbed. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. Okay, one note on our chart that relates to this, and it's kind of a technical note, and I'm not going to say too much about it because books and volumes have been written on it. I just researched a few of them this afternoon to see how far in detail I wanted to go, and I decided not to go into any detail at all, because once you start, you can't stop. Notice underneath that, Alexander Junius, question mark in parentheses, quotation marks, the teacher of righteousness, and then beginning of Qumran community. That's the only note that we have, the only important one, because it's the only note that we have. Okay, in the writings of the Qumran, or the Essene community, assuming that the two are synonymous, and that's not definite in the minds of some scholars, I'll call them Qumran, although it seems like the Essene were the same. In the writings of the Qumran community, of course, that's where we find Dead Sea Scrolls. Maybe I can put that up again to show you where everything is. Let's go up with it a little bit. Okay, here's Masada, which is one famous place in Israel, down here on the Dead Sea. And Qumran, right here, is way up at the north. Both of them are on this side of the Dead Sea, but it's way up on the northwest part of the Dead Sea. Here's the Qumran community. It's not that far apart. I mean, it's as far apart as the map has, but it's not that many miles apart. So there's the Qumran community, and you see it's very close to Jerusalem. Evidently someone has gone from Jerusalem over to the Qumran area to live. That's where we find the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1945, 46, 47, 48, whatever year they were actually discovered. Around 1947, here's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. But of course, not only were the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls discovered there, biblical manuscripts discovered there, but all types of personal writings in the library of the Essenes who lived here at Qumran, such as the Thanksgiving Scroll, the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, the Copper Apocryphon Genesis Scroll. All these important extra-biblical materials were found here. And one of the most interesting was the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And here in this material, as well as scattered in other of their writings, we have references to two evidently in the minds of the leaders and the people of the Qumran community, the most important people, two important people, one called the teacher of righteousness. Now, we're never told who this is or who it was or who it was going to be, past, present, future. He's simply referred to as the teacher of righteousness. The other was referred to as the wicked priest. These were the two most important figures and the extra-biblical figures in the writings of the Qumran community. The wicked priest and the teacher of righteousness. And many people believe, and I really can't give you my opinion without studying it a little more, but many people believe that Alexander Jannaeus was the wicked high priest. Notice we have beginning of the Qumran community, that this man was so wicked, killing not Sadducees, the liberals, but the conservatives, those who were trying to hold to Mosaic law, the Pharisees, impaling or crucifying 800 of them and then slaughtering their wives and children before their dying eyes. We have terrible corruption in Israel's religion at this time. And so maybe a group of separatists, although that's what the Pharisees were supposed to mean, or to be, but a group of extreme separatists wanted to separate themselves from Israel's religion and go and live out in the desert. And they, of course, picked the Qumran area and established the Essene or the Qumran community. And so in their writings, it's apocalyptic writings throughout. And it's a little difficult to understand. Maybe sometime in the future we'll study this, although it's so technical, I don't know if we'll have the need, but maybe we can just breeze over it sometime. It's a little difficult to know for certain, are we talking about, we don't think it's past tense from the time of the date of the Qumran community. Are we talking about a wicked high priest who lived during their time? Jannaeus would fit that. He's living during their time. And the teacher of righteousness, who maybe we're to take as the leader of the Qumran community, the teacher of righteousness also living during this time, and a future reference to one wicked man and one righteous man. If it's one wicked and one righteous, then of course New Testament scholars want to know, is this the origin for the Pauline concept of the man of sin, of the Antichrist, of the lawless one, of the wicked one, the sinful man that would be born, one wicked man in the end of time, and one righteous man, that was the messianic figure that was yet to come. So there's a big discussion about, was Jesus, when he came the first time, the second time, the fulfillment of their idea? Was that what they were writing about and talking about, this teacher of righteousness? Was the Antichrist figure of Paul, are we to take that as the embodiment of the wicked priest? He sits in the temple of God, 2 Thessalonians 2. The embodiment of the wicked priest of the writings of the Qumran community. I can say this, although I'm not for sure, I'm not made up my own mind or opinion about that. Nobody can prove their position on this one way or the other, for the simple fact that the writings of the Qumran community do not tell us. They just always are talking in general, the sons of light, the sons of darkness, and they are controlled or ruled over by the teacher of righteousness and by the wicked priest, by the wicked high priest. If we're talking about apocalyptic writing that has messianic overtones and overtures to it, and therefore anti-Christian overtures as well, Antichrist coming, then maybe someone like Alexander Jannaeus, as well as the leader of the Qumran community, was simply for them a point of reference. In other words, kind of like a type of what the real thing was to be like whenever it came in the future. So maybe Jannaeus was. All we can do right now is just leave it with that. But you need to be familiar with the terms wicked high priest and the teacher of righteousness. Because when you read, and if you read, you'll always come across those names sooner or later, especially in New Testament studies or studies between the Testaments. Okay. Oh, we've still got plenty of time. Let's go on and do some more then. Praise God. The more the better. We'll be through with all of this then. 76 to 67 then. We're coming down to Alexandra. We just mentioned her before. This is the same as the Salome Alexandra, and another man by the name of Hyrcanus II. So, thus far we know about, let's start with Salome Alexandra. Thus far we know that she has been the wife of the two previous Hasmonean leaders. Remember, she was the widow of Aristobulus that then released Janius, his half-brother, from prison, married him, elevated him to king and high priest. So she's been married to the two previous Hasmonean leaders and almost rightfully deserved to be the next leader because she's been, in the political scene all along. And so, I guess rightfully, she becomes the next leader. Janius, on his deathbed, appoints her to be the next leader after he dies, and she's around the age of 70. She's an old lady. She rules 9 years, from 76 to 67, and her rule was characterized by relative peace and quietness, relative in comparison to Janius and Aristobulus. Basically, she was a fairly good leader, we could say. So no longer do we have king, now we have queen. She's the first queen Israel or Judah has had now for centuries and centuries. Israel did have queens earlier, but they were bad queens. Now, her oldest son was named after John Hyrcanus. He became Hyrcanus II. And under his mother, Salome Alexandra, he was appointed high priest. That is why you have both names on your chart then. If you notice your chart, now we have divided up again with two leaders here. We've got one as political leader, Alexandra. Salome Alexandra is queen. She's political leader. Her eldest son, Hyrcanus II, is high priest. And then she appoints her younger son, Aristobulus II, as military leader in Israel. So we really have now three leaders, a political leader, a religious leader, and a military one. Salome Alexandra as queen, political leader, Hyrcanus II as high priest, the spiritual leader, the younger son, Aristobulus II, as the military leader. Now, another little side note that comes from tradition, not only did Janius, according to tradition, confess on his deathbed, confess all of his sins and so forth, ever since the end of the life of John Hyrcanus, remember the leaders have sided with the Sadducees and not the Pharisees, and so tradition tells us that on his deathbed, whenever he's repenting, then he instructed his wife to, from now on, side with the Pharisees, give up the Sadducees. Aristobulus had the Sadducees, he was on their side, Alexander Janius was, and so was John Hyrcanus after he repudiated his allegiance to the Pharisees to begin with. So this is what she did. She went over to the side of the Pharisees. And so now, because we have the political leader on the side of the Pharisees, this gives them the avenue for which they've been looking to punish the Sadducees. And so it led to another civil war. Notice the problems, and this will continue right up into the New Testament with Pharisees and Sadducees. You have to understand, first of all, their background, or the background to them and their origin here. And yet, why am I saying that? Well, here's what's remarkable. They were, you can tell from what I've said thus far, from John Hyrcanus, their time of origin, Pharisees and Sadducees, down to Alexandra and Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, they are bitter foes. They are bitter enemies with one another, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Why is it then, in the Gospels, they always seem to be on speaking terms? They've got a common enemy. When you end up with a common enemy, it almost puts you on the same side then. And they were such bitter foes, you would really have to end up with a bitter common enemy before you're ever going to go on the side of one another. And of course, that enemy was the Lord Jesus. That just shows how bitterly opposed they were to Jesus, or they never would have joined sides together at all.
Wow.
And you have to know that, or you're just confused. You don't know what's going on in the New Testament. That's why I'm always saying you have to know that before you can know this. And that's the same as anything. You have to know 1 plus 1 before you get to 1 plus 3, and then on beyond that. You have to start with some foundation, some building blocks. So it just shows their hatred for him that they would ever join sides, and they certainly did in the Gospels. Okay, I said that her reign basically is characterized by peace. Let me just give you a few points. We can kind of sum up some of the reforms taking place during her period, and we won't go into much detail about that. First of all, the Pharisees are welcomed back into political circles. They gained the ascendancy, in other words. Sadducees have had it since the end of the life of John Hyrcanus. The Pharisees gained the ascendancy in political circles. They're welcomed back in. Secondly, many important neglected Jewish ceremonies are now renewed. Remember, Janneus poured the water out at the wrong place, at the altar of the Feast of Tabernacles. So there were many important Jewish ceremonies which had been neglected because of Sadduceic control of the government. And so these are renewed. The poll tax is renewed, a half-shekel poll tax to be paid by every Israelite for the temple upkeep, stipulated way back in the law of Moses, but as with many laws, had passed in and out of favor with the people and therefore in and off the scene. The poll tax of a half-shekel for temple upkeep is renewed. And then finally, and this is an interesting point in educational studies, I guess, compulsory education for Jewish children is established under Alexandra. Compulsory education for Jewish children. But it wasn't in the 3 A's, it was in the 1 T, the Torah. That was their textbook. Not the 3 A's, but the 1 T. Okay, we've got a note there. Notice the note there, Pharisees in power. So we've got them back in power again. Okay, in conclusion tonight, we're just going to briefly touch on Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, and this is going to bring us to a whole new juncture then starting next week in our studies here, because notice the confusion here. Notice the dotted line underneath Aristobulus II. Well, did he control or didn't he control? You see, you've got Hyrcanus II up to 67. Then you've got Aristobulus, dotted line underneath him, the second, up to 63. And then back to Hyrcanus II, beginning with 63. So you can tell we've got a swapping of powers going on here. Let me briefly explain what happened here, and what happened here gave cause for one of the most important events that ever happened in Israel, and that was the Roman takeover of the country. And that came about basically because of the squabbles going on between Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Okay, let's start. Both of these men, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, are both sons of Janneus and Salome Alexandra, as I've already explained. The elder one, Hyrcanus, was of a real quiet disposition, a real quiet, passive, unassuming disposition. He was made high priest. The younger son, Aristobulus, the younger son, was much more ambitious, and he was the one made military leader. So that in 67 BC, this is on your chart, the date of the death of Salome Alexandra. In 67 BC, when Alexandra dies, Aristobulus II, he's just a little military leader. Hyrcanus is the important religious figure in the country. Aristobulus II, with the backing of the ousted Sadducees. You see, they're not in power anymore, so they're upset about that. So he joins with the grieved Sadducees and brought an army against Hyrcanus near Jericho. This is how we're going to end up with a swap in 67 from Hyrcanus to Aristobulus. That's what we're explaining right now. How does it go from Hyrcanus to Aristobulus? Then we've got to explain how does it go from Aristobulus back to Hyrcanus. Aristobulus II joins with the Sadducees. They bring an army against Hyrcanus II near Jericho. He's routed. Hyrcanus is routed, and he fled to Jerusalem. Jericho, remember, is not far east from Jerusalem. And there he surrendered to Aristobulus, his younger brother, on one condition. And that was on the condition, remember, he is of a quiet, passive, unassuming nature anyway. He doesn't want to be high priest. He doesn't want to fight anybody. He just wants everyone to leave him alone. That's all he wants. So he surrenders on one condition, that Aristobulus will allow him to live the unmolested life of a private citizen. He's not concerned with the fact that I have Hasmonean Maccabean blood in me. He's not concerned about that at all. He wants to raise his oranges out in the backyard and raise his children and just be a peace-loving, family-loving man. So he surrenders to his brothers. No surrenders, no big giving up to him. This is what he has wanted all along. He surrenders to his brother on the one condition that he can lead the life of an unmolested private citizen. He is granted that. And because he's so quiet, as I've said, he's probably relieved not to have the duties of the high priest to have to perform all the time. He is granted that, settles down to live a peaceable, quiet life in Jerusalem in 67 B.C., and turns both the political as well as the religious aspect of Israel's government over to his younger brother, Aristobulus II. Okay, are we up to date on that? Do I need to say anything there again? So that's how we go from Hyrcanus in 67 to Aristobulus. Now, why do we have the dotted line underneath Aristobulus? Well, it's because his government wasn't so secure. It was kind of back and forth. Between whom? Between him and Hyrcanus II. You say, well, I just thought you said that Hyrcanus II was content just to be a private citizen. Well, he was. But he met a friend who was no friend, but who wanted to become his friend because he wanted to be the power behind the titles of Hyrcanus II. That man is going to be so important, especially his descendants, Antipater. Antipater, who was an Idumean. Antipater. No, Hyrcanus was not ambitious, but there was a very, very ambitious man lurking just to his south, and that was Antipater the Idumean. Now, Hyrcanus cared nothing about titles, he cared nothing about the power, he just wanted to live by himself. Antipater didn't care too much about titles. He knew that being an Idumean, there's no way he can just walk into Israel and say, I want to be the next high priest or something, or I want to be the next king. He could not do that. What he wanted to do, since Hyrcanus had Maccabean Hasmonean blood in him, he wants Hyrcanus to assume control again. That is, in name, in title, but basically in title only, and let Antipater be the scene behind the scenes then. Let Antipater be the controlling power, an Idumean now, an Edomite, if you will, Old Testament terminology, an Edomite from Esau. Antipater wants to be the controlling power behind Hyrcanus. And so, here's what he does. He starts putting all these notions in the mind of Hyrcanus II. Remember, Aristobulus is now the new leader. Hyrcanus is just living a quiet, peaceable life of a private citizen there in the land, in Jerusalem. And Antipater begins putting the notions in the back of Hyrcanus' mind that your brother Aristobulus is suspicious of you. He's not going to let you live here as a quiet, unmolested private citizen all your life. Every brother is suspicious of another brother that you're going to murder him and take the throne from him. And so he's out to murder you, and he's going to kill you if you don't kill him first. So he starts sowing these seeds in the mind of Hyrcanus II. And so Hyrcanus II goes over to the side of Antipater, who then hires a Nabatean king, Aretas III, and we have a battle, an all-out battle against Aristobulus. one New Testament note, 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 32 mentions Aretas, a Nabatean king. But this Aretas in the Bible is not the same as what I'm talking about. He's a descendant. The one in the Bible is Aretas the fourth. This is Aretas the fourth in 2 Corinthians 11:32. 2 Corinthians 11:32. And we'll mention this man later on. So don't worry about turning there right now. But 2 Corinthians 11:32, that is Aretas the fourth. We're talking about Aretas the third. He's a Nabatean king, a king of the Nabatean Arabs. They all come against Aristobulus, who shut himself up in the city of Jerusalem in the temple in 65 BC. And that is why we have the dotted line, because we kind of have, no one's in control. It's kind of back and forth between these two men from 67 down to 63. That's why you have the dotted line. How do these brothers solve their problem? They do something that forever altered Israel's history. I'll mention it tonight, and this is where we'll pick up, and then we'll develop this for the rest of this study until we end the study in the political area. The brothers appeal to Rome for help. Hyrcanus appeals to Rome. Remember the rising eastern power now, because in 133 Attalus has bequeathed his kingdom of Pergamon to the Roman Senate. Hyrcanus II, Aristobulus II, both appeal their cases to the Romans. And this intervention, the intervention of the Romans, will be most significant for the future state of the nation of Israel. The power of the Mediterranean nation here, important Mediterranean nation of Rome, is going to soon come in, knocking right at the door of Israel, and has been more or less waiting for an opportunity to get her hands into the politics of Israel. So that is what, and notice, by the way, on your chart, at 63, notice the big black letters, Roman period starts there. The Maccabean period goes from 165 down to 63, or from 168 down to 63, and that ends Jewish political independence. And now we have Pompey's going to come in. Pompey captures Palestine in this year, and that's down the bottom of your chart, a bottom note, and we begin the Roman period. And this will become extremely, extremely significant. Obviously, the closer we get to the New Testament, the more concerned we are, because it will more closely relate to the New Testament and its themes.